All right, let's take a look at section 10.2, and essentially what we're going to be doing with these next three sections is traveling from entrance to exit through the digestive system, just to give you an idea of where your food moves, what are the processes that are happening, and essentially what are the anatomical parts, the organs that we move through. So starting off, we begin with the mouth. I know there's a lot on this slide, but essentially we need to understand these two processes of digestion, mechanical and chemical. And in the mouth, we begin digestion by reducing the size of particles. As you can see here, we would call that chewing. Okay, that would be an example of mechanical digestion. So chewing would be mechanical, and then mixing with saliva. Now, saliva contains an enzyme called amylase, which breaks down a lot of our carbohydrates. So if you put a cracker or bread on your tongue, you can feel it start to break down into something sweet. That would be chemical digestion. So right away in the mouth, we have an example of mechanical and chemical digestion. Now your tongue is going to help you with moving food while chewing, and it's going to connect to the floor of the mouth via the frenulum. So if you've ever stick your tongue up and you feel that like kind of weird piece of flesh that it's kind of like a flap of skin, that's what that frenulum is. And essentially that's to prevent the tongue from falling back all the way into your throat. Probably not a good thing. It also contains the papilla, which are the little bumps that we call taste buds. We'll get into that more later. The palate forms the roof of the oral cavity. We have a hard and a soft palate, as you can see here, and you can kind of feel around. The hard palate is right above, and the soft palate kind of in the back. You also have the uvula. Right, the uvula is a little thing that hangs down in the back of your mouth, and that's going to help with the gag reflex. You also have something called the tonsils in the back of the throat, and those are organs that protect against infection. It's essentially going to help you secrete some white blood cells. This is definitely something that you don't necessarily need to have. I know my tonsils are removed, and you've probably heard of lots of people who've had tonsillitis and had them removed. So we can survive without them, but it's just another means of getting our immune system involved in every part of our body. We also have teeth. We have primary and secondary teeth. We have incisors. We have bicuspids. And we have molars. So we're going to get into a little bit more on that. All right, so here's a quick image of the mouth. I just want to anatomically show you some of the things that we talked about. Obviously, here's the tongue. Here are your teeth. If we're talking about the incisors, that's usually going to be your first couple teeth here. Okay, we have the central and lateral incisors, as well as the canine. These are going to be our chewing teeth. We are considered omnivores. So, or excuse me, not chewing teeth, but kind of the tearing teeth. We are omnivores, so we eat both meat and vegetables. Okay, or herbivores, vegetation. So these front teeth are going to be involved in the tearing process, and then the back teeth are going to be where our molars are located, and that's going to be in that chewing process. The hard palate, as you can see, is kind of in the back portion. The soft palate runs along the top. Here is that uvula that hangs down in the back. And here's the tonsil. We have one on the left side and one on the right side. So just kind of give you an idea of those specific parts that we mentioned on the previous slide and where they are located anatomically in the body. Definitely not something necessarily you need to know or draw this picture down. I just wanted you to see them. All right, so let's dive into a little bit more of the tooth. So if any of you are looking at becoming a dentist in your near future or a dental hygienist, you need to know a lot about the tooth and specifically the anatomy of it. Any portion of the tooth that you see, okay, is going to be the crown, and that's going to project above the gums. And that little bottom part, which I'll show you a picture on the next slide, is going to be the root, and that's what is essentially anchored into your jaw. Now, the whole entire tooth is covered with something called enamel, and it's made of calcium salts, and calcium is very, very hard. If you've ever seen near a sink or a shower, usually the shower head is going to have this, or your sink, it's going to have like a white calcium buildup on it. So it's a very hard substance, and it can definitely protect your teeth, but it can also be removed with lots of things that are very acidic. Dentin is a little deeper in the bone, and that's very similar to bone. It surrounds the tooth's central cavity, but it has the same properties. And we'll have blood vessels and nerves that extend through the tooth via the root canal. We'll look at those in the next slide, but it makes sense. The tooth is very much alive. Those of you who've had a toothache know that there are definitely some nerves there as well. If you've ever had a dead tooth, that means that there is no blood running to that tooth, so that's kind of a problem. So here's a slide that shows kind of the teeth. Now, on the left, we have the children's tooth anatomy, and you'll notice that we have something called a central incisor, a lateral, a canine, and then we have some molars. As you get older, you should develop some back here as your adult teeth come in. We'll look at the names of the teeth in detail in the next slide. But this is something I do want you to draw into your notes. And we're looking at the tooth anatomy. And essentially, if you would follow my cursor up here, draw this outside part, which gives you your enamel of the tooth. Okay, that's that white portion. And then definitely draw another layer on the inside. This is the dentin, again, very similar to bone. And inside that, we have two locations where we have root canals. Okay, so you heard of someone getting a root canal. It's dealing with this portion right here. And this is where the nerves and blood vessels flow. So they are very deep in the tooth. And remember, I mentioned the word crown. Okay, notice that here are your gums coming in. Anything that you see above the tooth is considered the crown. So definitely get this picture. I would label the enamel. I would label the dentin, the crown, and I would definitely show some nerves and blood vessels going through there. All right, so here you can see we have the anatomy of the teeth done. So now we're going to look at the names of the teeth. So this picture on the right is going to be an adult mouth, and if you look, everything on the bottom is exactly the same on the top. Okay, so if you have two central incisors, that's going to be your two front teeth, and that's also your two bottom front teeth. And then from there out, we have our lateral incisors, which are the next two, and these are on either side. So if you can imagine, we cut this in half. You know, everything on here should match everything on here. And then after the lateral incisor here, we move over to the canine, and then to the first premolar, second premolar, first molar, second molar, third molar. Okay, so if you count with me, you should have on every side 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And if you have 8 here, you have 8 here, so that's 16. And you have 16 on top. Let's hope you have 16 on bottom. So you should have 32 teeth. Some of you have more if these type of teeth have come in, which you should know as wisdom teeth. A lot of you get those removed. So a normal person should have 32 teeth, 16 on top, 16 on bottom. So in the first slide I mentioned something called amylase, okay, which you can see here, and I hope by now you realize that anything that ends in that ASE is considered an enzyme. And its responsibility, we have these serose cells inside of the mouth, serose, and that's going to basically produce the amylase, and that's going to be involved in splitting starch and glycogen into disaccharides. So basically we're taking complex carbohydrates and simple carbohydrates and breaking down into sugars, okay? Now we also have mucus cells. So we have serose making amylase in the mouth, and we have mucus cells producing mucus. Now mucus is used as its function as a lubrication during swallowing, okay? And I really want to show you the 3 major glands that are in the mouth that are responsible for that, okay? So these are glands that are going to help produce the mucus and help produce the amylase. And these two things together are considered saliva. So that's why you notice that your saliva kind of sticks together. It's kind of mucousy. So we have the parotid glands, which are number 1 here, and that's way in the back, and that will swell up a lot. Number 2 is the submandibular gland. So those of you who remember your anatomy, the mandible is the jaw, so notice that that one sits in the back behind the jaw. And then you have the sublingual glands under the tongue. Now lingual means language. And if you've ever held your tongue and tried to talk, it makes it very difficult. The tongue is very involved in our speech. So to remember the locations, sublingual by the tongue, submandibular is going to be underneath the jaw in the back, and then parotid you're just going to have to know is in the back. Okay? So all of these glands are going to help secrete that mucus and that amylase to make our saliva. All right, we've finally moved out of the mouth, and we are now moving into the pharynx. And as you can see on this picture, it is basically the beginning of the throat. And the pharynx is going to be the portion that the food is going to travel down. The larynx is actually our voice box, and that's going to be our windpipe where our air is going to travel down. So essentially, we have a location right here that's going to separate. We have a two-way street, okay? And that's why sometimes we swallow our food, it goes down the windpipe through the larynx. Okay, that's a problem. We got to cough that back up. Food should go down the pharynx and eventually at the esophagus. So it's basically a nasal and oral cavity. That's essentially what it is. The esophagus, though, as we move down the throat here, moves to the stomach, penetrates the diaphragm at the esophageal hiatus. Essentially, what that means is your diaphragm is going to sit right above your stomach, okay, because it's going to help push air up through your lungs. So essentially, that esophagus is going to punch right through it, kind of a little hole, and then once we get past that, we're into the stomach, all right? Now we have something called a lower esophageal sphincter. And sphincter, as you can imagine, is going to be a very strong muscle, okay, that's going to help close that off. And that's going to prevent food and chemicals from moving up and out of the stomach. So those of you that have had acid reflux, you usually have an issue with that sphincter because it's not closing all the way and it kind of creeps up. We'll get into a lot more detail on that later when Dr. Hiley comes in because he specializes in certain procedures that help prevent that. All right, so here we are. We're going to start with the stomach. Now, the stomach is J-shaped, as you can see here, and we've essentially moved from the mouth to the pharynx to the esophagus and all the way down into the stomach. Notice that it says it hangs inferior to the diaphragm. All right, the diaphragm sits above here. It's a muscle. Inferior means below. All right, and it has only 1 liter of capacity. So imagine, you know what a 2-liter bottle of soda looks like. It's half of that. So if some of you have ever experienced overeating, it can be a slight bit painful. You probably ate more than a liter of capacity, so that's kind of a problem. Okay. I want you to notice some of the ridges in here. We're going to get into that a little bit later, but the stomach is very much a muscle, and it contains 3 types of muscle. Stomach muscles, we have longitudinal, oblique, and circular. And that's really going to help with this process of mechanically digesting. Your stomach will compress and squish and also actually push food out of the stomach into the small intestine, which we'll get into next. But before we do that, let's look at the 4 main parts of the stomach. Okay, we have the cardia, which is the esophageal opening. So essentially we're looking at kind of counties or states, if you want to imagine that, inside of the stomach. These aren't individual compartments, they're areas. From the cardia, we go into the fundus, which is a temporary storage area that lies slightly above the cardiac region. We have the body, which is the central area of the stomach, and the pylora, which we have the pyloric sphincter, and that controls the emptying of the stomach into the small intestine. Now, previously I mentioned that you see that lining inside the stomach. It's kind of bumps and ridges. That's all mucous membrane. And they have small gastric pits that contain glands. And those glands are going to help secrete stomach acid, all right, which is going to be involved in the chemical digestion process that goes on in the stomach, okay? So you might want to put a simple drawing down. I've highlighted a couple things. One, that this is the esophagus. Here's the esophageal sphincter. Here's where that cardia is located. Here's where the fundus is located. Here's the body, the pylora. It's also called pylorus, but that's just another example. I do not want you to put that down, that atrium. This is a little different picture, but at least it shows you these 4 areas that I want you to focus on. Here would be the pyloric sphincter, which is essentially the end of the stomach and the beginning of the small intestine, and that's going to prevent that food from coming in. So get a simple picture down. Make sure you have those 4 parts labeled. If you want to, feel free to write down esophagus, the esophageal sphincter, and the pyloric. That may help you as well. All right, on our last slide, I'm just going to focus on talking about the chemical digestion that happens inside the stomach. This is our stomach, flipped inside out. Kind of looks like a brain, but notice all the folds. In this class, and also in biology, we spend a lot of time talking about this big statement right here, increasing surface area. And we need to do that because inside the stomach, we have little pits that we're going to secrete gastric juices from, and that's going to help secrete a certain enzyme called pepsin. Pepsin breaks down proteins. So all of the food that you eat is high in protein. So any meats, any cheeses, basically any dairy products as well is going to have high levels of proteins. Okay, and that gastric juice that's secreted in all these pits and all these folds is going to help do that. Now, chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, is paste of food molecules after it's been broken down. And it's been broken down due to the movement, the mechanical movement of the stomach, and the gastric juices, which are the chemical involved in breaking down. And once that is done, chyme will be released out of the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine. Okay, so the folds that are all within here that increase the surface area and allow for this gastric juice to be at higher levels to make that chyme is called the rugae. Okay, So if we look at this little chart here, we can see that hydrochloric acid plus pepsin, which is here, are considered gastric juices. So I know that's not in your notes, you definitely want to put that down. You do have hydrochloric acid in there, and that's going to help with the chemical digestion of proteins. And once that's broken down, it makes this stuff called chyme, and that we can then exit out of the stomach and start absorbing nutrients from. That's everything from 10.2 from mouth to stomach. Hopefully you got some good info out of this. Our next video will be moving on past the stomach into the accessory organs.